Hi, my name is Kristen Mae Carbone, and this is Yumi and Brie Makes 3, a show about cheese for cheese enthusiasts. Today, we're going to learn how to go from milk to magnificence. So let's get started. First, you must start with milk. You can use cow, goat, sheep, or water buffalo. From there, we go into what I like to call the cheese making tree. This is basically kind of like a flow chart where, depending on what steps you take and what cheese you're trying to make, will determine what you do. So the first step on our cheese tree is pasteurization. There are generally 3 types of milk used. There's raw milk. This means that the milk has not been heated at all, completely unpasteurized, raw. The pros to this is that all the nuance, all the variance and flavor that you get in that milk is preserved when you're taking it to the cheese making process. The cons, any of the bad variants that's in that milk, if the animals got into something, bad bacteria, that's preserved as well. So why pasteurize in the first place? Well, you're killing off a lot of the negative variants, things that the animals might have gotten into in the field, any bad bacteria, that's been wiped away, so you've got basically a blank slate. On the con side, you're losing a lot of the good variants, those good bacterias, things like that, that can come in when you have pure raw milk. So, there's pros and cons to each, depending on the farm and their output, what kind of risk they're willing to take. There is a third type of milk. So the other option is thermalized, which is somewhere in the middle of raw and pasteurized. So you can keep more of the good bacteria, more of those variances that can come with a not pasteurized milk cheese, but you're eliminating the bad bacteria, which could be present in raw milk. And so you get kind of somewhere between the best of the both worlds. So now that our milk has been chosen, pasteurization or not has happened, we begin the actual cheese making process. Thus begins stage 1. So what happens in stage 1? Well, first the milk is pooled into a vat. It is warmed up to temperature, and then we add our starter culture. Starter culture is a variety of bacteria, and depending on the bacteria you choose, this is when our cheese tree begins. Depending on the starter culture you use will determine what type of cheese you end up with. So, what comes next? After the starter culture is added, the lactose, which is milk sugars, are converted to lactic acid. This gives the cheese cultures something to feed on. From there, we add rennet. So what's rennet? Rennet is an animal product taken from the stomach lining of an animal, corresponding animals with corresponding cheeses. So calf and cow, kid and goat, lamb and sheep, etc. Many traditional cheeses use animal rennet. Current iterations are using also vegetable rennet, which I'm not exactly sure how that comes. We should look that up one day. But basically, you don't need to use animal rennet anymore. People are going for more vegetarian cheese, if you will, using vegetable rennet. Ask your cheesemonger, ask your fromagere, ask whomever that you're buying cheese from if they know, if that is a concern for you. Pooling, warming, starter culture, rennet. From there, the curds are clumping, and from there the curds will set. Now, how long they set and how high the heat they're setting out will determine what kind of curd you get. Higher temperatures equal a more rubbery curd. Those of you who have ever had a cheddar cheese curd might be familiar with this. They are very rubbery, kind of squeaky. That's from being set for a longer time at higher temperature. That higher temperature will also yield a harder cheese, like a cheddar. And thus completes stage 1. As you can see already in stage 1, we followed so many different paths to give us different types of cheese, which is why I call it a cheese tree, because there are so many points throughout the process where you can really just completely make something different. And now, stage 2. So our first step of stage 2 is to cut the curds. This expels the whey. Now, depending on what kind of cheese they're trying to make, finer texture curd, a rougher texture, larger curd, will determine how much whey is expelled. So for example, if you're trying to make a firmer texture cheese, you want more whey out. So you're going to cut a finer texture curd. Rougher texture, things like ricotta, you actually are keeping a lot of the whey in there, which is why it's such a soft, smooth, spreadable cheese. So you're going to want more whey in. You're going to cut a rougher texture curd. Some cheeses actually have little to no cutting whatsoever. So even within our stages, we have sub-steps. depending, again, on what cheese you're trying to make. One of those sub-steps is really interesting. It's called cheddaring. All cheddars are cheddared, and cheddar styles are cheddared, but not all cheeses are cheddared. So what's cheddaring? Cheddaring is a sub-step in which you take the curds, pile them. I've seen them piled kind of like packed and piled like loaves almost, and they're stacked on top of each other. What this does is remove even more of the whey, at which point they are milled again before being moved into the molds. So what happens next? Well, some curds are cooked. This basically means they are reheated and agitated. Some are cooked more, some are cooked less, and some are not cooked at all. So the next step of stage 2 is salting. And there's a number of ways that they do this. You can either add it directly to the curd by machine or hand. I've seen some cheddars have that done. Either the finished cheese is floated in a brine bath. Some Emmentals do that. Sometimes the finished cheese is packed with salt. The other option is wiped down with a brine-soaked rag. Those are washed cheeses, and we'll discuss a little bit more about them later. And finally, molding or pressing. The harder you press, the harder the cheese. And from there, we go to ripening. And now the final stage, which is ripening. So, where is cheese ripened? Some, if you have perfect conditions, are ripened in a cave, which is a very traditional way of making cheese. However, not everyone has access to a cave. I mean, not in New York, you don't anyway. So people will use specialized storage rooms. These have the right humidity level and the right temperature. And that's very, very important. Why is that so important? Well, the wrong humidity and temperature can either lead to a drying out of the cheese or it ripening too quickly. This leads to a bad product, for which no one is happy after all that work we just went through. You may be wondering, blue cheese, how does that work? Looking at the cheese top down, one way is to needle it. That is to do exactly what it sounds like. Take needles, insert it into the aging cheese, which allows oxygen pathways to get in. That oxygen is fed to the bacteria, which uses it to grow and vein out. Thus blue cheese. Psst, Kristen, you mentioned something about a washed cheese earlier. What even is that? Well, a washed cheese is almost exactly what it sounds like. It is a cheese that has been washed. I brought it up with the salting process because there are some cheeses that are washed with a rag soaked in a brine solution. Some cheeses are washed in other things. Wines, spirits, eau de vies, etc. So why even wash a cheese? Well, you can, so why not? But also it does add some flavor and texture variance. The rinds tend to be very sticky, kind of orange, not always, but often, and they're funky. That's how those cheeses get that way. So if you ever hear a cheese described as somewhere between a foot and a fart, that's what they're talking about. A washed cheese. Look, it's an acquired taste. I can't explain it to you. So that's pretty much it for the cheese making process. Every cheese you have will follow one of the threads down that tree. And that's how we get back to this. So generally at my job, we break it down into 5 cheese types. Bear in mind, some cheeses will fit multiple categories. There are pressed cheeses that aren't cooked. There are washed cheeses that are pressed. There are bloomy cheeses that might have a little bit of a wash on them. It depends on how your cheese is made. I promise that might be the last time I say it. So what are the 5 cheese types? Fresh, things like ricotta, fresh cheves, feta. Bloomies, bries, camemberts, older goat cheeses that are still soft. Washed, things like époisses or vacherin Mont d'Or. There are pressed and cooked things like cheddars, manchegos, goudas, and then blues, things like Roquefort or Gorgonzola. These little biscuits are going to bed. You just watched a video where you learned about the cheese making process. Well done, you stuck till the end, you've learned something. Hopefully it'll help you, maybe on a trivia night or something, I don't know. I'm sure one day this will help me. If you have any questions, I try to keep this very general yet somehow specific, but if you have any specific questions, please put them down below. I'd be happy to answer. If you have any comments, put them down there too. That's where they belong. Like this video if you learned something, subscribe and share it with your fellow cheese enthusiasts. My name is Kristen Mae Carbone. This is You, Me, and Brie Makes 3. Fromagere Fridays at 5 p.m. Happy weekend.